accumulating, becoming more intensive. So by around 2008, in 2008 he had a very close female friend of his, romantic friend, had died, and he has a major depression, and this was what we call I believe this is the one that was what we call an anergic depression. It's a fancy word, but it means the person, instead of losing their appetite, just gains a lot of weight. He gained 40 pounds. He's just lying around. He has no energy at all. He's not agitated. He's just lying around. And he has his first major depression. Up until that time, this was a man who was anxious, sort of been depressed since his adolescence. Lots of anxiety, but then he has a major depression. So in a major depression, you have, 2 weeks of severe illness. You have eating disorder, you have a disorder of your energy, you have morbid thoughts of death, your mood is down. Sometimes it can be down and agitated. His was down and not moving. There's two kinds of major depressions. And he had his first major depression. Was untreated, like many depressions. After some time, they remit on their own. But he had a major depression in 2008.
Where did you gain this information that you're talking about now?
He described it to me. He described it to me. That was the one that he described to me.
And did you credit that
I
description?
did.
Why did you credit that description?
He told it to me. I believe he also told it to Dr. Kapoor, and it's clinically typical, and it's not really particularly directly related to the issues at hand here. He had there's a cause, and he had bereavement that went beyond normal bereavement. There was weight gain, and it seemed like it was a credible version. He described it. He went from sort of a chronically low-grade depression, depressed, anxious, we call it dysthymia, low-grade depression with anxiety, to having a superimposed major depression. And mood disorders have this way of, this is how mood disorders usually play out. That is, you have many people with depression, they don't get all the way better in between episodes. They have oftentimes mildly depressed in between episodes. And the other reason that this is relevant is most people who have bipolar disorder, they have a period of depression before they have their first manic event. In fact, they may only have one lifetime manic event. This is clinically typical. He didn't seem to exaggerate it. He just told me this is what happened.
All right, so this was 2008, you said?
This is 2008, yeah.
Okay, so bring us forward from there.
Then and shortly after that, eventually he meets Ms. Lawrence, and he's out of it by then because she remembers him being upbeat and happy initially when they meet. And he's with Ms. Lawrence, and then following the depression, we start to see him come after he comes out of the depression. We start to see him having what we call episodes of hypomania, and hypomania means hypo as in hypodermic, meaning under the skin, less than fully manic. Hypomanic, less than fully manic, and he starts having episodes of hypomania, meaning he's having periods where he doesn't need much sleep for a couple of days. He's painting the garage. He's working on his car. He's up a lot. And Ms. Lawrence notices it and says, "What's going on here?" And she notices it and talks about it in her deposition.
So stop there and talk a little bit about what hypomanic episode is. And you don't have to necessarily go through all of it, but the parts that are more relevant to what you were seeing and what Mr. Burgoyne, and was some of this information from Ms. Lawrence as well?
Yes.
Okay. From what Mr. Burgoyne said and Ms. Lawrence told you about Mr. Burgoyne.
And it's also mentioned Dr. Kapoor's records as well.
From her interviews with
Yes. So, there can be times when you're floating on air, and that's fine. People can do that. They can be pretty happy and floating on air. But this is a clinical situation where you have your mood is abnormally elevated. So instead of that anergic depression where he's lying around like a lump on a log, he's elevated. He doesn't need much sleep. He's talking fast. Ms. Lawrence talked about how he would often go a mile a minute, and she I can't follow him. He'd be up doing goal-directed activities, working on his car, painting the house. He'd go from one activity to another, the distractibility. He talked about that there were times when he'd be hypomanic, that he would be planning vacations and buying things on the internet. Not extreme, but more than his average. And so he had it would be a distinct mood elevation. And this is common. This is common that before people have a full manic episode, they have periods of hypomania. Just like, sort of mirror image, before he had his first major depression, he had periods of where he sort of chronically low-grade depression and anxiety. And this is just a normal course of this, one of the many ways this illness can present bipolar disorder. Your first event doesn't have to be fully manic, it's hypomanic.
And then, again, where's this hypomanic episode definition that you've been talking about and is on the board here? Where does that come from?
This is from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual version 5 that came out 2 years ago. 2 years ago, I think it was.
And again, what's the commonly referred to as the DSM?
The DSM.
So what's the DSM-5?
It's the diagnostic manual. So it's for research and for diagnosis. So when someone says this medication works for this illness, there's an agreement about what illness are we talking about. And the definitions shift over time, a little bit over time, because it's based on ongoing research, ongoing research and clinical consensus. So this has been this diagnosis and this description's been pretty stable.
And for a hypomanic episode, according to the DSM-5, you have to have at least 3 of the following symptoms and must change their behavior and be present to a significant degree. Correct?
That's correct.
All right. And we talked about he had decreased need for sleep.
Definitely.
He had flight of ideas or a subjective experience that thoughts are racing.
He had some of that. He would be more talkative for sure.
Increase in goal-directed activity.
Definitely. Painting, working on his car till all hours of the night. And for a couple of days in a row, not needing much sleep. So we had these episodes. It was he told me about it. He told, Ms. Lawrence mentioned it, told it to Dr. Kapoor. And that's not, and by the way, people who have hypomania don't tend to complain much about it. This is good. There are captains of industry who are hypomanic for a long period of time. They're very productive. They like not needing much sleep. They get very productive, and there's a whole literature of people who love their hypomania, and of course, and they don't want medications because I don't want to stop this. Of course, and then they often have to pay the piper when they either flip into a depression or the hypomania becomes really clinically impairing. So the thing about hypomania is you don't need to be in the hospital. You don't have an extreme loss of function. So if you look at E, it doesn't cause marked impairment in social or occupational functioning. So lots of people like their hypomania. It's just that most people end up paying the piper. They either get fully manic or they flip into a depression if you don't get some control and some stability of the moods.
And again, where are you getting this information from? From your interview with Mr. Burgoyne, but are you just relying on what he had to say?
Well, from what he told me, what he told Dr. Kapoor, and what Ms. Lawrence reported. And Ms. Lawrence, and I give a lot of value to what Ms. Lawrence reported because they were at loggerheads around lots of other issues where she, got them in lots of trouble. But so she reported this, and I take that with a lot of import.
So this is in the early, is this during the period of time where Miss Lawrence is saying he's happy, or is coinciding?
I don't know if she got him at a good period or not, but I don't know what she was referring to when she said he seemed pretty happy when I met him.
So take us through then, that's 2008, 2000, take us forward.
Well, that hypomania doesn't last, and he had more primarily periods where he would be depressed and anxious. And so even in approximately year 2010, 2011, he's working at a Heritage Toyota, and he'd be anxious, and he'd be sometimes locking himself in the bathroom because he couldn't really deal with the public, and he had a job where it involved dealing with the public, and he'd be anxious and uncomfortable. And he starts using he's using marijuana to try to quell his anxiety.
So what of his history as we move forward was relevant to your analysis? He's continuing his relationship with Ms. Lawrence?
Yes. So then in 2013, on her birthday, she announces she's pregnant with their child, Izzy. He asks her to marry her. And he stops drinking. Up until that time, he was a moderate drinker. He'd have, a couple of big micro brews, 8% alcohol, whatever, a night, and on the weekends maybe some more. He wouldn't get grossly intoxicated. He stops drinking, and he stops drinking in part because he's concerned that she drinks as well and wants to model not drinking because she's pregnant.
So what happens, what's of significance happens with Mr. Burgoyne after the 2013 when Ms. Lawrence becomes pregnant?
So then in 2014, they're about to get married. And he has a mood switch. And she notes that something's wrong with him. And he calls the groomsmen and the bridesmaids and says, it's off, cancels the whole thing. They stay together, but the way she describes it sounds like a result of his sort of a mood switch, and there's something wrong with him. She didn't know.
So, and where are you getting this information about him having mood switches or mood swings?
From her.
Did you get that same information from Mr. Burgoyne?
Yes.
And so, is he having, or does he switch into a major depressive episode in that period of time?
Yeah. I think we got ahead of ourselves. He had another, I forgot, going back to 2010, we skipped over that. He had another major depression when a woman he was very close friends with suicided. I'd skipped that. So he had a second one at that time. And I forget which one he had the 40-pound weight gain. I forget which one it was, the first one or the second one, but I'm sorry, we skipped ahead. I forgot the second major depression. Anyway, going back to...
Let's go back to that then. So there's 2008, you described a major depression. There was a friend, who had overdosed, and then your second one in 2010 with a friend who committed suicide?
I forget how the first one died, but I know the second one, I believe, was a suicide.
So two major depressive episodes prior to this, to 2000, what we were talking about, 2013.
Correct.
So let's just talk about what's a major depressive episode. Okay,
so it's a clinical condition that lasts 2 weeks, and it's extremely serious. There's this menu of things that you have to have.
Is this taken from the DSM?
This is from the DSM. So for 2 weeks, you either have a depressed mood much of the time, or you have loss of interest in things. It's called anhedonia, lack of hedonism, anhedonia, non-hedonic. And in fact, he had both. Ms. Lawrence commented that he would come home and he wouldn't even play with the baby. But that wasn't this episode because the baby wasn't around yet. That was other depressive episodes. I'm getting ahead of myself. So anyway, he describes having a major depression, eating disorder, lack of interest, lying around. He had one of them was weight gain, one of them was weight loss. I forget which one was which. Problems with and then here with the sleep disorder, you can have a sleep disorder when you're hypomanic. You're not sleeping, but that's just fine. You've got plenty of energy. But here, you can't get to sleep. Can't get to sleep. You either have initial insomnia or awakenings. And so he had problems with sleep disorder and lack of energy and not doing well. So it sounded to me like he had had 2 major depressions, 2008, 2010. And the last one, morbid thoughts of death. And he mentioned that a couple times to me, and I think he mentioned to Dr. Kapoor that he had morbid thoughts of death. He had never tried to hurt himself, but he would have morbid thoughts of death.
What does that mean, morbid thoughts of death?
Life isn't worth living, that kind of thing.
All right, so from your interview of him, you have, your opinion is he had 2 major depressive episodes prior to meeting Ms. Lawrence.
Correct.
And then after he meets Ms. Lawrence, there is this hypomanic period at times.
He would have ups and downs. She would notice he'd have a few days where he'd be up till in the morning and to early wee hours doing things, and other times he'd be flat.
And then there's the announcement of the baby, but then after that there's these mood switches, is what you call them.
Yes.
Ms. Lawrence.
And they're starting,
describes.
And then after the baby, they're under financial difficulties.
And why is that important? How does that relate to Mr. Burgoyne's psychiatric history?
It's a big stressor for him. They're not making ends meet. At one point, she's working and he's unable to work. He just stays home. One of those episodes she described, he was home for a few months, unable to work, or not having the energy to work, not having the energy really to be interested in playing with the baby. And then he goes back to work and she's not working, or not working much, and they're just not making ends meet, and it's a lot of stress for them.
So are what Ms. Lawrence and Mr. Burgoyne described to you important for your opinion in this case?
Yeah, well, it shows that he's starting to have mood cycles.
Okay.
And mood cycles, cycling between hypomania and depression. And it also shows that these are stress-related. The stressors, he's affected by stressors, relationship with her, financial stresses, and that his mood his depressions continued even though he'd stopped drinking.
Why is that important?
Well, alcohol is a depressant.
And do you know whether he's continuing to self-medicate with marijuana?
He is. He didn't do it to get high. He didn't like getting high, so this is a distinction. He did it because it quelled his anxiety, would help him sleep. Lots of people who have bipolar disorder use marijuana. It's frequent. It helped him sleep. It helped him feel less anxious. He had lots of aches and pains. It helped him with his pains. At one point, Ms. Lawrence talked about how this is a man who at one time could carry, I think her words were just about verbatim, could carry a refrigerator up the stairs, and he'd have such aches and pains that he could barely get up the stairs himself.
And so during this period of time, 2013, 2014, are there other symptoms of depression that you noticed in Mr. Burgoyne through his history?
13 and 14, I think it's just the same pattern. He's not having any more major depressions after the one in 2008, 2010. He's cycling between periods of hypomania and periods of being down.
So then take us forward from there. What happens of significance to your ultimate opinion in this case with regard to Mr. Burgoyne going forward after the baby is born?
Well, he has the upset with the canceling of the wedding and all that business, and then they end up having marital discord that gets them up in court. He
Was
had,
that in Vermont, or do you know?
the first one was in Massachusetts in 2014, Newburyport. And she alleged that he had assaulted her, pushed her, I think pulled her hair, and she goes to the police, and he's in trouble with the court.
And why is that significant?
At that point, they're separated. The court says he has to get anger management. She goes up and lives with her father in Colchester. He doesn't see the baby for 6-8 months, I think it was, until they get back together in 2015. So that was a big stressor for him. He was really upset. He's really tied to this baby. He loves this baby.
And did you know whether or not Mr. Burgoyne did? You said there was some court-ordered anger management.
He did. He saw a graduate student. From reading the graduate student's notes, and it's corroborated what he told me, basically did a workbook. There wasn't diagnostic. It was a workbook on anger management.
So you actually saw the records from his...
Yes. And I would say that it did not take a longitudinal history of him, didn't take a psychiatric history. It was mostly, oh, you're here for anger management, here's his workbook. Sort of more educational and less of what a medical professional would do.
And so then you said that he came back to Vermont and eventually reconciled with Ms. Lawrence?
They get back together. They eventually go back to their condo. They have a condo. And that's where the financial stresses are really happening at that point. He's trying to make a living. He eventually comes to Lake Champlain. His friend Alan Kosovic gets him a job or refers him to Lake Champlain Chocolates. And she's not working at this point, or minimally working. It's not exactly clear. She tries to get a teaching certificate and can't get it. And so there's a lot of stress between them, and they don't get along that well.
How do people with bipolar disorder get along with other folks?
Well, it depends how their mood is and how the other person behaves. Both, right? It's interactive. So if he's depressed and irritable, he's going to have a short fuse. If she's contributing to lighting that fuse by their interactions or by things she does that he's concerned about, he had concerns about her. And then there was one concern that particularly concerned him was he says she filled out a application for financial aid that was fraudulent. And he's a stickler for doing things properly, stickler with his taxes, and he thought that was she was moving to manipulate, to separate him from the baby, whereby asserting in a legal fashion that she's solo, and in Vermont, he explained to me that if you're not married, you don't have parental rights as a father. So he thought that she was moving towards trying to have the baby and break up the relationship, and then he would not have access to the baby.
And were you made aware that there was an incident in May of 2015?
There was, yes.
And did you review all the documents, the police documents with regard to that?
I did.
And did you also review Ms. Lawrence's several statements about what happened?
Yes.
And did you also speak with Mr. Burgoyne about it?
I did.
And how does all of that information relate to your ultimate opinion in this case?
Well, he assaulted her, according to her, and he pushed her, and the way he describes it is she's leaving with the baby. He says, I just want to have, we should break up. I don't want to have our relationship. I just want to have access to my daughter. Let's figure out something that's equitable. She starts to leave with the daughter, and he forces himself into the car. I guess, as I understand it, she was putting the baby into the baby seat in the back, and he forces his way into the car, and they're driving around. And he's yelling and screaming, according to her. At one point, and they're near, I believe, is the Williston police station. He's screaming and saying, you know, I could go off the, or she says, I could go off the road, and you know, with you all. And so I asked him about that, and he said, look, we had been in the car for 20 minutes by that time. I was using this rhetorically, saying, look, I just want to have access to this baby. You know, can't you calm down? Like, I'm not going off the road. You know, I could go off the road, meaning I'm not going off the road. This, you see, I just want to, like, calm down here. I just want to have access to my daughter. You can't keep absconding with the daughter. And that was his concern. I don't think it was an actual threat. He says it wasn't an actual threat in any way. It was a rhetoric. He was saying to her rhetorically, and then things calmed down. They drove around for a while longer, and they calmed down enough for them to go home. And he's calmed down enough to think, you know, he has some resolution, that they're going to have a fair resolution. He goes up to take a shower, and she takes off with the baby and goes to the police.
How is that whole event, how does that play into or affect Mr. Burgoyne going forward?
So that was May. Then there were court hearings, and the results of the court hearings in September were that he has a stay-away order from her, and that he gets to see her, and he gets to see the baby an hour a week on Saturdays at gymnastics. But meanwhile, that whole summer, he's mourning the loss of this baby. He doesn't see the baby from May till October 1st, and this is an extreme stressor for him. He's depressed. He's primarily depressed, and anxious and upset and missing the baby. He says there were a couple of times that he thought that she had been in his house when he wasn't around, because stuff was cleared out of the house, that some of which was his. So he's really depressed and upset and not doing well in those months, and leading up to October.
So what's your understanding about what happens in October of 2016 with regard to his relationship with Ms. Lawrence and the child?
So on October 1st, he is supposed to see Isabella, in Essex at a gymnastics class. And he still has this no contact order with Ms. Lawrence. And as I understand it, she comes there. Instead of the baby being brought by a neutral person, she shows up, and she's there. And he doesn't really get any interaction with the baby. He's behind a glass plate for most of it. He sees her, but he's concerned that Ms. Lawrence is there, and he has this legal prohibition from being in contact with her, and also it's intruding on his 1 hour in the past 6 months. He's very upset about that.
What was your understanding about whether there was going to be another visit or not? Was this just one visit on this?
No, it was going to be the next Saturday, same time, same place, 10 o'clock on the 8th.
And did you speak with Mr. Burgoyne about what his feelings were with regard to continued visitation with his daughter?
It's all that mattered to him. He was going to bring her chocolates from Lake Champlain. He promised her to bring her chocolates from Lake Champlain chocolates, and he was looking forward to it. And he mentioned it to Seema Kosovic. I'm looking forward to seeing my baby next week.
Is that information you gleaned from reviewing a statement by Seema Kosovic? In
her deposition.
So, can you describe, well, you've said that you believe, your opinion, that Mr. Burgoyne was grossly psychotic at the time of the accident.
Correct.
And now we're a week prior to the accident.
Right.
So can you describe how it is that Mr. Burgoyne went from where he was on the 1st to being grossly psychotic on the evening of the 8th?
Sure. So he switched. He was primarily depressed, and they had this stressor, and he switched. And you see his switch even looking at his phone records. If you look at his phone, I looked at his phone records from September, I think it was 8th, I forget, it was early September through the night of the accident. And he had to be at work at 6:30 or 7. He would clock in, and you see him going to bed at 11 or 12. And because well, let me just clarify that. You'd see his phone records as there's no phone calls or text messages going after 11 or 12. And then starting actually September 30th, and then that week, he's up every night till you see phone records of texts or messages going to 2:30, and that's an abrupt change. The whole previous time he hadn't do that. So he's now you see his sleep has changed. I infer his sleep has changed by looking at the phone and text message patterns. Then what happens to him is sort of clinically typical of how a psychosis starts. So his mood is switching, and his mood is what's generating his psychosis, the beginnings of his psychosis. So he's had these switches all along, and now he's switching again, which is clinically typical, to flip from a depression into mania and hypomania to start. And so you see that in the timings of his sleep changing, and then you see his reports. So initially, he's on the internet Monday, Tuesday of the week of the accident. And he's doing his usual thing of being on the internet, doing all kinds of explorations. And he's not sure. He gives me and Dr. Kapoor consistent stories, but he's sort of within a day or so, he's not sure exactly, was it Tuesday, was it Wednesday, but starting around the early part of the week, maybe Tuesday, he gets involved with a discussion about Colin Kaepernick, who I mentioned earlier, and he's upset about the fact that players are taking a knee. And then he starts getting into research about missile silos in Vermont, and who are the commanders relevant to missile silos, and Eric Snowden and the NSA, and he's having interactions with people, and he's getting down these sort of paranoid places on the internet. And then he says, and this is, I hear this story a lot, things start catching his eye. He starts thinking that things that he sees, he's starting to see connections that catch his eye and seemed, that's interesting. And he starts seeing things that are connected even though they're not connected, but they seem to catch his eye, and he starts to have this sort of grandiose idea that they're seeming to catch his eye because it's him.
Does that have a psychiatric term?
Yeah, so ideas of reference is that things in the environment that are benign, like the name of a street or an internet website, is particular to you. So you start taking things that are just neutral and benign in the environment and start thinking they're referencing you. That's where the word ideas of reference comes from.
So is this definition of ideas of reference from the DSM as well?
Yes, that's in the appendix, the definitions.
The feeling that casual incidents and external events have a particular and unusual meaning that is specific to the person?
Yes.
And how is that different from a delusion of reference?
Well, we'll have to discuss what a delusion is first.
What's a delusion?
So it's the shortest definition in psychiatry. It's our only one. It's a firm, fixed idea. A delusion is when someone believes something that's extremely unlikely, okay, that is not consistent with reality. And you can't talk them out of it because they believe it to their core. Exception to that is if it's part of their culture. So if I said to people I know that you can stick a pin in a doll and someone's going to die, if someone really believed that in my culture, that would be a delusion. If you're from Haiti and you believe in voodoo, that wouldn't count because that's part of the cultural beliefs there. So it has to be culturally not accepted, the belief.
So again, there's a definition of delusion, a false belief based on incorrect inference about external reality that's firmly held.
Yes, firm, fixed idea. You can't talk them out of it. They believe it to their core. You can't, by definition, you can't talk someone out of a delusion. It's a psychotic symptom.
So, and that's different than what you're describing Mr. Burgoyne as having in the early part of that week, which is ideas of reference.
Yes, so he starts out with ideas of reference early on, and then they start to intensify. So his mood is elevating. So the driver of his psychosis is his mood. And you see this, it's a little bit of a tangent here, but it's relevant. You see that the driver of his psychosis is his elevated mood. And you see this later when he's toggling between thinking, I'm being chosen for something because I'm special and I'm being recruited, versus they're going to kill me. And because we know that untreated mania and psychosis in non-forensic contexts, in clinical contexts, people switch. They're varying. They're going back and forth like this, flipping back and forth between this is great, I'm special, and oh my God, I'm frantic. And that's what happens to him. It starts out sort of mild, and then it intensifies over a couple of days. He says by Wednesday, the way he describes it, by Wednesday, he's believing that things that are physically impossible are happening to him. So he didn't have internet connections. He has brand new $700, 1-month-old $700 cell phone, and he made it into a hotspot. Well, then he sees the TV doing Morse code static with him, communicating with him, and he sees radio on his phone, radio in his car, seemingly direct to him, and this is critical in this case. And he's starting to see things in the environment as connected to him. And he starts thinking, oh, my house is, my electronics are communicating with me. And who can do that? Well, who else can do that but the government? It's the NSA or some kind of government entity.
So this is, you're getting this information from Mr. Burgoyne, correct?
Correct.
You're not getting this information from any other source than Mr. Burgoyne and reviewing other statements made by Mr. Burgoyne.
To me and to the other examiners.
And you're aware that Mr. Burgoyne, well, you don't interview Mr. Burgoyne until 2018.
Correct.
And you're aware that he is interviewed in November after the crash.
He is.
Ms. Kiley?
Correct.
And you reviewed that interview?
Yes.
And does he describe this information as well at that time?
Very similar, yeah.
And he was interviewed by Dr. Cotton in December of 2016?
Yes.
December 1st?
Yes.
Okay. And again, in Dr. Cotton's interview, is he describing information about this stuff that we're now talking about?
Dr. Cotton says in one of his reports that he thinks that it's likely or he may, I think his word was may, have had psychotic delusions.
But the question is, when you're interviewing him for the first time in 2018, this isn't all news to you. This is the first time you've heard it. You've actually reviewed the interviews where he said a lot of this stuff already.
Certainly.
So, I mean, one concern would be if you were just interviewing somebody for the first time 2 years later, that somehow they had made it up in the 2 years that they were sitting around in jail.
Yeah, that's true.
But in this case, you had at least 2 interviews done within a month of the accident.
And not only, there's other reasons why I didn't think he was making it up.
we'll get to those. But I just wanted to place your interview in time. So then let's go back to kind of the slow, you said he starts with these ideas of reference.
Yes.
Not the paranoid, frantic exhilaration toggling that you were talking about. We're starting slowly with ideas of reference.
That's correct.
Why is that happening?
The mood disorder is driving his psychosis. He's becoming manic, and it's driving his psychosis. So, in schizophrenia, you just have a thought disorder, and you don't have to have a mood disorder. But in bipolar disorder with psychosis, it's the mood disorder is driving his psychosis. It's creating his psychosis.
Have you seen this before, or is this the first time?
Common. Seen it hundreds of times. This is dog bites man.
So then, what does Mr. Burgoyne describe to you that's relevant to your opinion about how things progress during the week?
Well, partly it's the fact that it doesn't start off full freight. You wake up and bingo, you've got a full developed delusion. He doesn't do that. So either he's extremely sophisticated and has researched how delusions start, or he's describing something that's clinically typical. I think the latter. And then he has his doubts. He's trying to figure it out. So when he's got ideas of reference, there are all these different strands of information that he's misinterpreting. And so we all naturally try to make a narrative that explains all the different pieces of information, right? And he can't figure it out because why? Well, he can't figure it out because these strands are fake. They're not real information. He's misinterpreting them. So the television is not communicating him with Morse code through the static. His car is not communicating with him by the tempo and the selection of songs.
So you said that it was critically important in this case, the car. So what did Mr. Burgoyne tell you about what was going on with him when he was in his car?
So he's driving around in his car, and he starts thinking that, well, the car radio is now communicating, not just my TV, not just the electronics at home, but on the road. And how could that be, right? And he thinks maybe it has something. He's trying to find an explanation. Has my Bluetooth been hacked? He thinks that the Bluetooth on his cell phone has been hacked, the Bluetooth between the radio and the car. And how is that? How is someone controlling? Because he'd be driving, and he'd make inferences from the music. So the music tempo would change song by song, and the music lyrics would change song by song, and the quality of the music. And he had the sense that if he would turn one way, the music was signaling to him, oh, that's the right way to turn. Or if he turned the other way, go back the other way. And he likened it to like a coin detector when you're on the beach and you can hear the beeps, as you get closer to the coin detector on the beach. And he cannot figure it out. He cannot figure it out except that it's the government that must be they're communicating with me. And probably psychologically relevantly, he starts to develop the idea that it has a feminine quality to it. And there's sort of a psychological explanation about why I think it's a feminine quality to it. Who's communicating with him, this thing that's communicating, this agency, whatever it is.
And what is that?
Well, at the very end, when he's in the ambulance and it's a female ambulance driver, he thinks, oh my God, this is finally the person who's been communicating with me. But why is it? Because all the people in his life who've been important to him are women. His mother, his grandmother who had died in May 2016, which helped set off his depression, along with losing the baby. His aunt who had taken care of him when his father eloped with, elope's not the right word, but left with the woman he was having an affair with. His grandmother, the baby, the girlfriend of his who had died, Asima, most of the people in his life who are important to him are female, and I think it probably relates to the fact that he's a 12-year-old boy, 13-year-old boy, helping his mother get up the stairs as she's dying from cancer. and emaciated.
So how do things progress through, when you're talking about the ideas of reference start early in the week, and then how do things progress as the week goes on?
So then he goes to work on Thursday, and he sees a crossword puzzle sitting around the cafeteria, and he thinks it has, and he looks at it, someone's sort of half filled it out, and he thinks it has maybe something to do with drones, and he takes it with him to study later because he thinks there's some communication in the crossword puzzle. And Thursday or Friday, he's at work, and he thinks that there are people there working on the servers, and someone makes a remark about the cloud. It's all up in the cloud, I guess, if the servers were to blow up or something like that. Don't worry, the information. And he starts thinking, oh, cloud, stuff's up in the cloud. It's being, and then he starts thinking, then he sees printed invoices for the chocolate orders, and he thinks they look like they're communicating with him or they're personal to him. By chance, two of his coworkers are talking about another person. One of his coworkers, I think it was Chrissy Gleason, talks about a man he had been communicating with online, Mike Phillips, and there's something about him being investigated or followed by the FBI. And he's just over the top with all this stuff. He's seeing signals everywhere from his car, on the invoices. There are men working on the servers. What's that about? He's really, by Thursday and Friday, he's off to the races. He's really delusional, thinking there's something going on here, and I am the center of it. So the flip side of paranoia is grandiosity. So whenever I see a patient who says they're being followed and they're after me, I say, well, why you? And sometimes I get an answer, sometimes I don't. But it's they can't. Sometimes they don't know. And he had a sense why, that he had been this really smart, successful guy in the Army, and now here's his chance because he's so IT savvy, and he's a patriot, and he's being selected finally to do something, to be recruited for something special.
So first, he's excited.
He is over the moon. He's grandiose. This is great. Wow, I've got this figure. They must be recruiting me, but they're doing it in this secret way, so no one can know about it. I can't tell Asima about it. I can't tell Alan Kosovic about it. I have to, not tell the truth when I tell my boss why I'm resigning, because this is, top secret. This is classified. Otherwise, I could lose my chance.
And how's his sleep during the week?
Not sleeping much. In fact, by Friday morning, I believe, he was last up till 2 or 2:30, texting or calling with Asima, and then another's an outgoing text, I think, Friday morning at 5:40 in the morning. So he's certainly, at most he's got a couple hours of sleep. He says he didn't get any sleep.
And is that consistent or inconsistent with what you believe was going on with him psychiatrically?
I believe that's information that supports the idea that he's not sleeping and he's manic, as well as psychotic.
So it's probably a good time to break.
Yes, please.
Okay, so we're going to take the mid-afternoon break. And again, have a good break, but avoid conversations about the case with each other. Thank you.
Please. Leave your notebook here.
Okay, 15 minutes. thing, because I have no idea what you're showing.
Oh, you would like copies? Can you make a couple more copies?
Yeah, just so I can see what's being shown to the jury.
Print out some more copies.
All rise.
Okay, please be seated. Let's resume the testimony.
Thank you, Alan. So we're back in that week before the accident. Were you able to review collateral sources, in other words, somebody other than Mr. Burgoyne, to see if you could get any information about how others were
Yes.
appearing him functioning during that week?
Yes.
All right. And what information were you able to find?
His supervisors and SEMA and Alan Kosovic.
So so folks at work?
Yes.
What did the people? Do you remember what somebody at work said?
He wasn't looking like himself. He looked scruffy. And one other person said he was making uncharacteristic errors. He's not the kind of person to make errors. He's making errors at work. He also approached, he oddly approached, it was in Ms. Kirchgasser, I think it was Ms. Kirchgasser, or Ms. Gleason, hanging, huh?
Folks at work?
Yes. On Friday, hanging around, wondering if he had caused some other employee to leave. Had he done something wrong? He didn't, they both commented he did not seem his usual self, and one of them commented he made uncharacteristic errors because he's a pretty careful guy.
And so who was, you mentioned SEMA a couple times. Who did you know SEMA Kosovic to be?
So Asima Kosovic and Alan Kosovic Alan Kosovic had been his long-term friend. Asima was his wife. He was very close, actually, with both of them. I mean, he was very close with Asima. They would text a lot through the evenings. She was very concerned about him. And they went out to dinner on Thursday night before the accident at Al's something restaurant, Al's restaurant. And she said he was not himself. He was looking right through her. He didn't seem himself. He was off. She could tell something was wrong with him. And, he didn't want to tell her that he's on a special mission. He doesn't want to disclose this because he doesn't want to ruin his chances. But he looked off to her, and she knows him well. And either, I think it was Friday morning, 4 a.m, after one of their, Friday, I guess it was Friday morning, she or Alan sends him a text like, "Are you doing okay? I hope you're okay." I think must have been Thursday. Must have been Friday morning.
So Thursday into Friday.
Yeah, Thursday. So, and he's, he doesn't respond, but they're concerned enough about him. I forget, was it Asima or Alan? Are you okay? Is everything okay with you? So those are and then there was collateral information from Ms. Lawrence that when she went to the house this is a man who's very neat and clean and orderly in his dress. In fact, I think one of the coworkers, his bosses, said usually he's starched and pressed and looked great, and he looks scruffy at work. And usually the house was in complete order, and the house was in shambles, filthy, no cat food anywhere for his cat, like not being cared for.
So how did things progress from Thursday then into Friday? The accident's on Saturday night, so now we're Thursday into Friday. Does Mr. Burgoyne report sleeping?
He says he doesn't sleep anything at all into Friday, and then he goes to work on Friday morning. He parks his car far away from the others, so I think it was Miss Gleason who mentioned, why is he parking his car way away from all the other cars? He has this interaction with Miss Gleason or Miss Kirchgasser, I forget which one. Is everything okay? He's doing terrible. He sees these guys working on the servers. He thinks it has something to do with the NSA, and then he sees the invoices, and he thinks these even the printed invoices are referencing me. How could that be? Then he leaves midday for his lunch.
And you described he was initially excited about all of this. Has he remained just excited about it, or what's going on?
No, now he's getting kind of nervous. He's toggling back and forth about what's going on, because he's not so sure. And this not so sure is, am I being recruited and am I special and this is a good thing? Or why are they targeting me, and have I stumbled across something in my internet research that they, unquotes, don't want me to know? And he starts to toggle back and forth about that. Thursday he's pretty exuberant. He's, oh man, this is great. I get to be, something special for the U.S. government. Sort of, going back psychologically to his sadness about not being able to be in the Army, I presume. And now he's kind of, whoa, these people are all over me, and I'm not quite sure. And he's going back and forth. Thursday he's positive and excited. Friday he's toggling between excited and moving more towards anxious and paranoid.
What is he anxious and paranoid about?
That he's stumbled on something and they're after him. They're in trouble. He's in trouble because he's found something, with his research with the missile bases and who controls the missile bases and NSA, and he's found something out that he's not supposed to know.
And so he said he leaves at lunch break. Did he report doing anything at the time of lunch? He
did. He goes out and he's driving, listening to the radio, and now the radio is really taking over his interactions with the driving, turning one way, turning the other way, based on the radio is giving him a positive signal that that's the right way to turn, or a negative signal that that's the wrong way to turn, based on his inferences about the songs, the lyrics, the tempos, the music, and what he's thinking that's indicating to him. And he ends up somewhere out near Heinsberg, comes back to work.
Were you ever to verify through any collateral source that he went on a drive out towards Heinsberg on Friday?
There were cell phone records that indicate he went out there. So then he comes back to work, and he's observed coming back to the parking lot and then immediately leaving. Then he goes over to Alan Kosovic's house, and he tells him he's quit. He says something about a test, but he doesn't go into any details. And he doesn't want to divulge. Again, he's not sure about Alan Kosovic. He's not quite sure who he's allowed to tell after this is classified, and he's in this position of being selected or recruited or tested.
And so how is it that the person that you're describing, Mr. Burgoyne, could be, as you're describing psychiatrically, and then have lunch with Mr. Kosovic, who doesn't notice much better?
Sure. Well, he's holding it. He's not telling him. He's holding it. He's holding it tightly. He doesn't want to tell him. He doesn't trust him. He doesn't think he's allowed to tell him. And by that night, he doesn't trust him because, or maybe it was the night before, he had looked at his Bible, Alan Kosovic's Bible, Eastern Orthodox Bible or Russian Bible, and it didn't contain a section from John 3:16 that he was in, that Mr. Burgoyne was familiar with, and he says, "Oh, what's that about? That he doesn't? His Bible is different." He's again reading things into what he perceives about this Eastern Orthodox Bible. Is well, does that mean that Alan Kosovic is friend or foe? Starting to have doubts because he's starting to get paranoid generally, even about his friend.
But as far as it making sense that he could be this way and Mr. Kosovic not notice that he's going on, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it makes sense because Mr. Kosovic didn't appear to, reading the two depositions, Mr. Kosovic didn't seem to notice as much or recall as much as Mrs. Kosovic, who said there's something plainly wrong with him and I'm concerned. So, you know, I don't know Mr. Kosovic. I don't know how attentive he is. Maybe Mr. Kosovic simply just thought, well, he's just off because he's upset about his daughter. And but again, Mr. Burgoyne is not sharing this information with anybody.
Up until this point, Mr. Burgoyne was continuing to self-medicate with marijuana?
Yes.
Did that stop at some point?
Yes. So on Thursday, he thinks, oh, you know, if you're being selected for this, you know, you should be laying off the marijuana, and that's probably one of the reasons he didn't sleep at all Thursday into Friday, because he didn't get a chance to use the marijuana. He says by Thursday into Friday, he'd either decreased or stopped, and then on Friday afternoon, after seeing Kosovic, he threw all his paraphernalia and drugs in the trash.
You've talked about some paranoia that Mr. Burgoyne had. Did he have other thoughts of paranoia during this week period?
Well, eventually he starts thinking that eventually he starts thinking that his daughter's in danger, and even Ms. Lawrence is in danger. But I think that was more by Saturday.
What about with regard to his house? Do you think anything was going on with his house?
Yes, he thought his garage was bugged, and he thought of course the electronics in his house are communicating with him or bugging him, and then he starts thinking. Eventually, he starts thinking he has to sleep downstairs because Homeland Security is going to come and may burn down his house. So then,
does anything happen Friday night that's significant with regard to Mr. Burgoyne?
Yes.
What happens on Friday night?
He goes driving again, listening to the car radio for directions, and then he's also getting directions or making interpretations based on lights in the environment. So he sees the car radio is giving him directions, or he's inferring directions. And by the way, he never said the car radio spoke to him.
Why is that significant?
Well, he never claimed that he heard voices. He misinterpreted benign, neutral material in the environment. He's never really said that he has hallucinations, which I count as important because usually people who are faking, malingering, add a little bit about, you know, the voices told me to do it. And he doesn't do that.
So what happens? You talked about the lights. What is it about? What does it tell you about the lights?
Well, he's making interpretations about the colors of the lights and arrangements in the lights. He goes by an ATM, and the ATM lights are green. He says, well, the bank is closed. Why is the ATM lights on? He thinks that must be sinister. The ATM, the green light for the drive-through, I guess, from the drive-in park ATM, he thinks that must be something sinister, so he drives over and looks at the screen, and he starts thinking the screen on the ATM is referring to him. And then and I'm not sure about the order of that, exactly when that is, but then he eventually keeps driving and he ends up in this field.
So tell me about that.
So as he's driving, he also thinks there's a drone, maybe a drone following him, and he's making and listening to the radio and thinking there's a drone. He's sticking his hand out the window, making hand signals. Again, thinking he's being trailed, and he's signaling. Ends up in this field, has his nap, and on the way he had stopped at McDonald's because he inferred that he was supposed to pick up something to do with pumpkins, and he buys a pumpkin muffin, which he would not ordinarily eat, and he brings it with him, and he's got his pumpkin muffin and a bottle of water and his treasured K-bar knife from the military that he's had for 20 years, and his cell phone. And he gets out of the car and he sees grass glistening in the moonlight, and he says, "Oh, that's my pathway. That's for me. That's for me to follow." He misinterprets a benign thing in the environment that, this is what he's supposed to follow.
Does he tell you what he thinks is going on? What he thinks is going on?
Yeah, he thinks he's going to. Well, he's toggling. He thinks he's going to meet or do some test. He's doing some sort of test or meet some sort of government agent. He's not sure. He's not quite sure what he has to do. It's a test, or he has to meet someone. They're going to meet him there. Government agents are going to meet him there. And by this time, he's carrying his passport around with him because, as he told Dr. Kapoor, he thought that he's going to have to quickly travel on short notice and might be, quote, whisked away, unquote. So there he is at the field with his passport and those other items. The passport, he thought, also had certain directions in it, and things would, quote, pop out at him, information in the passport. So he's really quite confused, having thoughts that are all a jumble, and he's frantically trying to figure out what's next, where am I going, what am I supposed to do, and am I safe?
So he's at the field, he sees what he interprets as a path from the moonlight in the grass. What happens?
He follows a pathway. He goes down to a river or a stream, and he's hears some sounds. He throws his knife in the stream.
Why? Does he tell you why he does that?
He may have, but I forgot why. By his inferences. Throws his knife in the stream, hears sounds, gets nervous, and runs back to his car. I think I'm trying to remember where he threw his cell phone in there along with I think that was the second time at the stream he throws his cell phone in. Anyway, he runs back to his car, and then he's there. During this time, he's there for about an hour and a half. According to the cell phone records, he's there, and then he sees a perfectly round culvert, symmetrical, and he says, "Oh, that's the true way," or "That's too good to be true," because it was so symmetrical. And again, he thinks that's a signal, and he crawls through this water tunnel or culvert, and he goes back to the stream. And I think that was the time. That was the time when he, thinks that he's going to. Oh, I think I skipped. I think I reversed this. The first time at the stream, he thinks he's supposed to jump in. He thinks that they're there to. They're going to make me jump in and make it look like a suicide. And he gets scared at that idea, and he runs back. Then he goes back to his car. Then sees the culvert, goes back to the stream. He's still hearing. He hears like a sound, a helicopter, whatever. Sometime during this time, he calls a phone number in Alabama that I looked up. So the phone number is for Alabama Reaper, R-E-E-P-E-R. And that coincides with the thing that he thinks a drone is following him. And he had mentioned to me and Dr. Kapoor about Grim Reapers, so he's not sure if this drone that's after him is there to assassinate him. Anyway, and so at that point he's terrified. He's terrified. He smashes his phone, throws it in the river. And at one point, either the first time or the second time, he had lost the cap to his water bottle, and he's again toggling back and forth, and he thinks, "Oh my goodness, I've made a mistake. I've left evidence that I've been here. This cap from a water bottle, and then oh, that's a problem, or maybe they're going to be after me for that." So he's really confused, and then he goes back to his car.
And did he ever describe to you thinking that something was going on in the water?
He hears sounds in the water. He hears droplets. He hears He hears something crash into the water. He thinks that means maybe someone's there. And he hears droplets. He's misinterpreting just benign things in the environment.
So at this point, do you think he's having ideas of reference, or he's delusional, or?
He's very, very paranoid. He's having delusions of reference that are toggling between, I'm here to be selected and tested, and I'm here to get assassinated because I've stumbled on something and they're after me. And he can't tell. And by this time, unlike Thursday, he's much more frantic. He's much more anxious. He's not comfortable.
And so what is he got to the point where he dropped the water bottle cap. What goes on when he drops the water bottle cap?
He's frightened because he can't find it, and he thinks it's a sign that he was there, and that was sort of a that will show that he was there, and leave evidence that he was at the waterside, and he's not supposed to leave evidence because he's in this test that they're testing him for his recruitment.
And so then what happens after that?
So anyway, then he leaves, and that's probably when he drives down to Montpelier.
Did he describe the trip to Montpelier?
He did.
What did he? Well, let me ask you this: did you review cell phone records with regard to Mr. Burgoyne?
Yes.
And did they verify that he was out at someplace by a river during that period of time?
Yes.
And that his cell phone stopped emitting signal at some point?
I think it was at 7:30 at night on Friday night.
And then, what did Mr. Burgoyne tell you about this trip to Montpelier? Well, first of all, did he tell you why he went to Montpelier?
Yeah, he thought from his interpretations of the radio that he's supposed to, quote, go to the Capitol, unquote. And so he goes down to the Capitol. He goes down to Montpelier, and he drives over to the rear. He drives into the rear, or I don't know where he drives, but anyway, he's in the rear of the Capitol Hotel, and he tells me and Dr. Kapoor he sees lots of foreign license plates there, and he sees the fire escapes that are on the rear of that building, which I'm familiar with, having stayed in that hotel. And he goes up a couple of flights because he thinks that they're trying to signal him, and he's trying to get a clear signal or signal to them. Goes into the restaurant, walks by the restaurant, it's closed. He notices right next to the hotel in that parking lot, there's a ATM, and he's noticing that, and he's not clear what that's all about. So that's where he is. He goes to the Capitol, and the Capitol Hotel.
And so then, what is Mr. Burgoyne? Well, is Mr. Burgoyne clear that this happened on Friday night?
No, he thinks he can't. He doesn't recall whether it's Thursday or Friday night.
And so what did he do after? At some point later on, in between Friday and Saturday night, did Mr. Burgoyne show up at the Kosovix
He
residence?
did. He showed up at 4 in the morning.
And what significance does that have to you?
Well, for one thing, it shows he's up at 4 in the morning and traveling around. It would fit that he had gone from the field to Montpelier to Kosovix, and who knows where else he went. He shows up there, and he's peculiar, and Asima thinks he's really off.
And you just
And they invite him to stay, even though he lives close by. They said, "You sure you don't want to stay over?" He says, "No, I don't want to stay over."
And does he describe to you? Did he describe to you in your interview kind of how he was thinking, kind of at that moment when he decides to go over to the Kosovix residence?
Yeah, he sort of sees I think there's an illuminated doorbell or something, or he sees a light, and then there's he's not really trustful, and even a little bit starts to not be completely trustful of Asima.
And you talked about this Bible time with Mr. Kosovix. Is that during this 4 a.m. visit?
I forget it was then, or it was the Thursday interaction with Kosovix. I forget which one it was, but it was John 3:16, and didn't have it in the Bible. And well, how come it's not in your Bible?
And again, how is it that Alan and somebody like in Mr. Burgoyne's state could be in the presence of two people who are only noticing, he seems off, or he seems out of it, and not, they wouldn't pick up on him being as delusional as he's describing?
Well, he's not disclosing. He looks off, but he's not disclosing why, and maybe they think he's simply distraught. After all, it's 4 in the morning for them as well. They were, I guess, sufficiently concerned about him to suggest that he stay over there at 4 in the morning, which would be, he lives around the corner somewhere.
And Mr. Burgoyne leaves their residence at some point.
Yes.
And where does he go?
I presume he went home. He thinks he went home. But the next thing we know where he went is UVM Medical Center.
So now we're into Saturday morning?
Saturday morning.
And so how do we know he arrived at the medical center?
Because we have him on videotape and lots of witnesses.
And were you able to review security video footage and all the medical records from his time at the hospital?
Yes.
And does Mr. Burgoyne describe to you going to the hospital?
Yes.
What does he say about that?
He was, at that time, he was really completely fearful that he wasn't safe. And he was just worried about his safety, and he was also worried that somehow they were going to, whoever they are going to go after Izzy in particular, as well as potentially Ms. Lawrence. And he, for that reason, gives up. His fear drives him to come to the hospital rather than see his daughter, which is the shining light and the only one thing he really wants to do. So to me, it shows how frantic and confused he must have been to go to the hospital. I guess he had a sense that something's wrong, and he felt unsafe.
What was your understanding of when he was supposed to see his daughter?
10 o'clock.
On that Saturday?
Nearby in Essex.
And this would have, so he had a visit on the 1st, and this would be the next Saturday, a 1-hour visit.
Yes.
Jumping back just for a second, Mr. Burgoyne, did he tell you if he went home or not between the Kosovix and, or between the time out in the field and going to the hospital? Did he say that if he went home or not?
I think he said he watched the sun come up, and that he was. I think said he watched the sun come up.
And did he say he did anything with his clothing when he was home?
Oh yes, you're right. He washed his clothing.
Why did he need to wash his clothing?
We were full of mud from crawling around in the mud in the culverts.
Do you remember if Ms. Lawrence said anything about the state of the home at some point that corroborated whether or not he had been covered in mud?
Yeah, I think she said she saw there was mud in the bathtub.
So, in your opinion, do you believe that Mr. Burgoyne was going to the hospital on Saturday morning because he was suicidal?
No, he was frantic and was concerned about his life. He thought his life was in danger. He wanted to be safe. The exact opposite.
So you reviewed the videos and the reports. What do you take away from Mr. Burgoyne's visit to the hospital that's relevant to your final opinion? And if you could distinguish between information you're getting from Mr. Burgoyne and information you're actually seeing from the record.
Sure. So he goes to the hospital. I think it was 8:45 in the morning. Gets to the hospital. You see him on tape, and he comes in and he tells me that he's a little paranoid about the construction, and he sees something about brain tumors, and he not quite clear what's going on in the hospital, but he finds his way into a secluded, a secure area just off the emergency room entrance, where the triage nurse sits, or triage lady nurse sits. And they say, "Whoa, what's going on here? Why are you back there? This is staff only." He's looking at a poster, and they call security. Security comes, and he's looking at this poster, and the poster had something to do with needing volunteers for a respiratory study. Anyway, there was some other poster that might have had something to do with head injuries. Anyway, so the security guy says to him, you're not supposed to come this way. And there he is, and then he's, do you want to come, the triage person, do you want to come in? And he says no, and then he leaves.
So what is, and you're getting that from the security cameras and depositions of the security folks, not from Mr. Burgoyne, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And what does all of that say to you?
Well, he's confused. He's coming there for help. He's frantic. He's making inferences about the hospital, about the construction and the signs, etc. And then he sort of gets nervous and leaves. But I don't know where he went. But he didn't go. At that point, he could have easily driven to Essex to see his daughter, but he doesn't. He comes back about 45 minutes later. And you see him pulling back in his car, in his truck.
And so then, what is your understanding, again, if you can differentiate between what you're getting from the record and what Mr. Burgoyne tells you, but what's your understanding of what happens when he returns to the hospital?
So he goes back in, and they see him, and they say, "Oh, here's this guy," and security goes and meets him. "Can I help you?" And he wants the security guy gives him a number for this volunteering for some study that this poster that he saw. Gives him the poster, and then he checks in, and he gets seen by the triage nurse.
Okay. And what you were able to review the record from the triage nurse?
Yes.
And her deposition?
Yes.
Okay. So what is of significance to you that goes on with Mr. Burgoyne and the triage area?
So she, as is standard, the nurses, when you go into these situations, they ask you, "Are you in pain?" It's part of actually hospital accreditation, and they show you this pain chart, and he's looking at this pain chart, and the nurse takes pains, no pun intended, to comment that he's confused about this pain chart, that he doesn't understand it. He's certainly smart enough to understand it. And my inference from that is that he's confused, and he has ideas of reference, and he can't understand a simple pain chart. And then she also takes pains to notice that his language is disorganized. And she mentions that, and then on the triage nurse intake.
That he said she tried to go over the pain chart with him, and he didn't understand the sentences and the words.
Yes. Yes.
So what's the significance of all of that to you?
Well, I think it's not because he's not smart. My explanation would be that he's in a state of confusion. His thoughts are racing. He can't put it together, and potentially he's thinking that it has ideas of reference that are, even though it's asking about your pain, but he's interpreting something else about this pain chart or the pain chart.
Is it consistent with your diagnosis of Mr. Burgoyne that he's not walking in the triage and saying, the government's out to get me, I need help?
Yeah, he's saying, I want to go someplace where I feel safe. He's going there for refuge. But he's not quite clear if he's allowed to declare why. And you see that play out a little bit later with the passport business.
And is that consistent with your diagnosis?
Yes.
How's that?
He's still paranoid. He's paranoid, he's disorganized, he's confused.
So what happens after he's in triage?
So he sees another nurse, and she puts him in paper blue scrubs and puts him on a gurney, and he's got warm blankets on him on the gurney, and he then tells me, "Great, he felt great. I'm safe. I'm in the hospital," not discriminating that he's actually in the mental health portion. He had been labeled as a mental health patient. His little bracelet said crisis, which is a sort of workaround for mental health patient. And so he feels safe for a moment, or momentarily safer. Okay, I'm going to be here. I'll be safe. So that's where he is with her.
And does anything come up with regard to his clothing?
Yes, so his clothing is off to the side, and she says, well, if you're going to come into the hospital, we have to take your clothing away. So at that point, she's there. There's mention in the notes that there was a sitter as well. So usually when you're in a screening unit, someone comes in and you're getting put in the hospital, people are enough concerned to have you in the hospital. You're put in a place where it's sort of safe, right? No belts to hang yourself. No sharps, and they've got a sitter there. So he's got a sitter, someone's minding him. And she tells him, okay, well, I have to take your clothes, meaning the clothes would normally, get bundled up and brought up to the unit and put in a locker, and then they assess you. Once you're on the inpatient unit, you get assessed for your safety. So once people, they think you're pretty safe, and the nurses get to know you, you get your clothes back. But standard treatment is no. If you're sick enough to be coming into the unit, depending on the policies in different units, we keep your clothes till we notice what's going on. You don't get your belt. Some places you don't get your shoelaces, and so they wanted to do that, which is probably their standard operating procedure. And he's saying, wait a minute, because he's got his passport in his pants or
so what is
clothing.
What is Mr. Burgoyne? Does Mr. Burgoyne talk to you? This discussion about the clothing it's actually in the medical record and in
Yes.
the depositions by the nurses.
By the nurses and the PA as well, yeah.
And but what does Mr. Burgoyne tell you about what's going on with him with the clothes?
He doesn't want them to take his clothes because the passport's in it. And remember, within the past 24 hours, he thinks he's going to get whisked away, and he needs his passport in case he has to go somewhere for the government and maybe even go to a foreign land. He'd gone to the Capitol the night before. So he had said that he thought that the passport itself had some qualities, that it was, quote, the information on it was, quote, popping out at me, unquote. And so he thinks that passport is, well, important for his safety.
And that was, again, noted by the nurse that Mr. Burgoyne reacted. Do you remember how she said he reacted when she was trying to take his clothes away?
You can't take my clothes away.
And so then what happens after he is meeting with the nurse at the hospital?
The PA comes and does a brief exam.
What does the record tell you about the exam with the PA? No, PA,
Physician's assistant.
physician's assistant. Okay. So there's an exam by the physician's assistant. What does that exam tell you from the record and the deposition of the physician's assistant, not from Mr. Burgoyne?
So it's a pretty superficial exam. He tells her, I'm just here, I want to feel safe, anxious. Apparently she makes mention that he talked about some of the things that were going on with his daughter as well. So his issues about anxiety, feeling safe, and his daughter. She doesn't really get into or doesn't document, and I didn't see in her deposition, so she said, what's the safety issue? Safe about what? She doesn't get into that. She just does what I think is a very superficial exam, and says, "Well, if you don't want to, if you don't want to stay, you got to go," and that's the interaction.
So, what does Mr. Burgoyne tell you about that interaction with the physician's assistant?
He didn't. He wanted to convey he wasn't safe, but he didn't feel comfortable saying why, because he's not sure that would make him less safe. It wouldn't make him less safe, and he didn't understand. He thought he was already in the hospital, right? He's on the gurney with the warm blankets. I'm here. What's happening?
So what did Mr. Burgoyne tell you he did?
He left. Put his clothes on and left.
And is that corroborated by the records at the hospital?
Yeah, he left before they could give him all of his discharge recommendations.
So the PA is in with him, the PA leaves, and what happens next according to the record?
The sitter was, apparently there's a mention of the sitter. The sitter wasn't, the PA comes back to give, the PA either sends the nurse back or the nurse comes back and says he's gone, because the PA had told the nurse, give him, so they say, discharge recommendations for follow-up care, the Howard Center, crisis, etc., if you don't want to stay. And so he never got those, never had a final interaction with the nurse, and he's gone.
So what does the sitter know when she goes back into the room?
He's gone.
What about the sitter?
I think the sitter was gone too. So
what does Mr. Burgoyne tell you about why he left the hospital?
they said I couldn't stay.
And so what does he do next? Or do you know what time it is that he leaves the hospital?
Yeah, it's 11:03 or 11:03, I think it was. So he gets there at 9:45, and then the tapes have him coming out, I think, at 11:03. I think there's a note from the PA at 11:08, approximately, if I remember right.
Okay, and so what's significant about those time frames?
Well, he's there for a good long time, and he thinks he's getting admitted to the hospital, and suddenly he doesn't understand why he can't stay in the hospital.
And then it's 11 o'clock on Saturday, so what has Mr. Burgoyne missed at that point?
He's missed seeing Izzy.
Does Mr. Burgoyne talk about that with you?
Well, he knew he had missed Izzy. He certainly knew that by then.
And then what does Mr. Burgoyne say he does after the hospital?
He goes home.
And what does he do?
He goes to sleep on the couch downstairs because this is the day, I'm reminding myself, this is the day he's afraid Homeland Security might come and burn the house down.
So what does he do?
He falls asleep. He's been up for a couple of days.
And then, well, what happens after that? After he's home? This is Saturday now, midday, and then we're getting into the day and then the evening of the crash.
Yes.
I assume you spoke with Mr. Burgoyne at length about that?
I did.
Why was that important to do?
I wanted to know his mental state and what happened.
would it be important or helpful for you to refer to your report during this portion of your discussion of what Mr. Burgoyne had to say?
Sure.
And why is that?
Well, his quotations are just so credible to me.
So what is he? Now, your report with regard to what Mr. Burgoyne said occurred on Saturday, is it just what he told you?
My report includes all the sources of information I had when I wrote this report.
But if we're talking about what's in your report with regard to what Mr. Burgoyne said happened, you had other sources of information other than just your interview with him, correct?
Yes.
What did you have? You had Ms. Kiley's interview.
I had Ms. Kiley's interview. I had what he told Dr. Kapoor. He mentioned some of this to, I think, Dr. Cotton. There's not a lot about it in Dr.
Cotton, your report, you didn't have Kapoor's report yet, right?
That's correct.
So you had Cotton, Jamie Lee Kiley, and then your own hours of interviews with him and Dr. Lewis.
And the neighbor, his across-the-street neighbor who works for Homeland Security.
Right. Who saw him driving away.
Correct. And saw when his car was there. I think he said his car was there at 5:30 and heard him depart at 11:15.
So I think if you would start on, if you were to refer to page 23, I think you talk a little bit about what he told Ms. Kiley about what went on with him that day. And if you need to, I think this is important for you to be precise as to what Mr. Burgoyne said was going on with him. So not necessarily asking you just to read it, but whatever you think is important to convey what Mr. Burgoyne had to tell you and what was going on in his mind as we went into the evening on Saturday night.
Judge, I just want to make sure, I don't know if he's refreshing his recollection with his report right now, or if he's asking him to read from his report, but the report is not in evidence, and I would object to him just reading from the report.
Response?
Judge, I think he wants to relate what Mr. Burgoyne had to say about this evening because it's important to understand his diagnosis, and he wants to be accurate.
No, I understand that, but I think the format would be you would ask the question. If he remembers, he answers, and we don't have to resort to the report. If he doesn't remember, you can refresh his memory.
That's fine. So we'll do that, Dr. Rosemary. So if you can remember what Mr. Burgoyne had to say, and if you need to refresh your recollection by looking at your report, you can do that. But why don't we just start with what you remember him telling you about what happened on Friday evening?
Okay, well,
Saturday evening, I'm sorry.
I can't quote it without reading my report. I can summarize it point by point, but not verbatim from my memory.
So why don't you summarize it, and if there's a quotation that you think is important and you need to refer to your report to refresh your recollection about what that quotation is, we can take it a step at a time.
Your Honor, I'm confused if I'm allowed to read the quotation if I can't.
I think we're going to start with a summary of what you remember, and Mr. Kadams understands how to refresh recollection if need be.
Okay. So he was sleeping on the couch because he feared that Homeland Security might come and burn down his house. And then he says he eventually gets on the highway, and the radio is singing songs that are like high energy to him. He uses the phrase high energy. And he thought...
Honor, I'm sorry.
Yeah, sidebar, please.
Please be seated.
There must be something really interesting out there.
taking your report from me.
Well, I haven't used it yet, so we might as well keep it away from me.
All right. So why don't we try again? Again, if there is something in your report you think that would refresh your recollection, I'll give it back to you. How's that? All right. So why don't we start with Saturday evening, again, driving again.
So he goes off driving, and he's being and he is listening to the radio, and the radio is giving him directions which way to turn, the same way they'd been doing for the past couple of days. I would need to recollect. I need to take a look at my report to see what his next main point was about that. But that's where he's driving, listening to the radio. This is at 11:15, presumably, when his neighbor hears him leave and peel out after that.
So looking at defendant's K, refresh your recollection about what the next major point was?
I don't remember if there's another important detail that I should mention about what his version is. Thank you.
So just read it to yourself and then what do you...
So he thought he was going to be paired up with somebody else. That he's going to be paired up. He's going to has a meeting. He's going to be paired up with somebody, and he's concerned about the guy across the street who he knows works for Homeland Security, which I think is a true fact, not just a fantasized, paranoid fact.
Objection.
Okay, let's just go through, we're going to do it this way. We're going to go through kind of what you do remember and about the evening, and then as we go forward, and then we'll fill in if we have to.
Okay.
So without getting it all exactly precise, what is your understanding of what Mr. Burgoyne has said about what occurred that evening, going into Saturday evening after he left his residence at 11:30?
He's driving, listening to the directions from the radio, and then he doesn't really know how he ended up going the wrong direction, and he doesn't understand it. It wasn't intentional, and then he remembers the impact, which he likened to helmet-to-helmet impact, like when he was playing football.
And what does Mr. Burgoyne tell you about what happens after the impact?
After the impact, he goes down to the median where there's the Jetta and the teenagers, and he looks and the car is aflame, and he looks in the front seat, and it looks like the two people in the front seat are like a mother and a daughter, and they look like CPR-type mannequins that appear to be breathing, and that he thought that was part of the test, that it was a setup, and that the setup, in fact, had something to do with making it look like, again, that he had been in an accident. This is part of the test, and they're still going to take him, and it's going to look like the setup. This is fake. This is set up by the powers, the they, and this setup of these fake people are part of the setup and the test, because there's some ulterior motive from these government powers to make it look like it was a real accident.
What does he say happens next?
Then he sees lights. These are lights, white lights. He sees white lights and blue lights, and he think that's the next part, that he has to escape or get it. The next part of his, he likened it to his training in the military. Evade, escape. This is part of the, part of the SEER training, SEER training, that, when pilots are shot down, evade, escape. I forget what the other two parts of that acronym are. Resist, I think that's when you get to interrogation. And he remembered, so he's saying, oh, my next part, what I have to do next for this test to meet up with this companion or whatever this person is, of a feminine kind of companion who's directing this, he had the sense, is to go to get, and that car has been provided for me by the government that's putting all these pieces there for me, just like they've been doing for the past couple of days. And so he gets into the police car, Shepard's police car.
And what does Mr. Burgoyne tell you he does next?
He starts driving, and he sees cars. He says, I'm being careful not to hit anybody. He sees cars, and he interprets after a short while that, in fact, even though he's going the correct direction, he's going the wrong direction. He also says that when he was in the car, in the police car, he pushed a bunch of buttons and toggles or whatever they are. I think buttons, he says, and various lights changed. And he's listening to the radio in the car. He's listening to what the radio says and making inferences from the radio about what he's supposed to do.
And what does Mr. Burgoyne tell you he does next?
He turns around because he thinks he's going the wrong direction, even though he's going the correct direction.
And what does Mr. Burgoyne say happens next?
He does not remember the impact with his own truck. Not surprisingly.
Why not surprisingly?
Because he had massive facial injuries and a concussion, and generally people who have severe concussions don't remember the moment of impact. They get a slight bit of retrograde amnesia from the moment of the concussion, when the brain's concussed, and he had multiple facial fractures, 4 or 5 of them, that ultimately caused him to have cerebral edema and almost die, but we're getting ahead of ourselves.
So what, in your opinion, is going on with Mr. Burgoyne from the moment he leaves his house until the time of the first accident?
He's following the directions from his delusions of reference about what to do to be safe and to follow directions from the government or whatever agencies were directing him. And he's terrified. He's terrified.
So is he, again, we have these ideas of reference and delusional? Is he
Delusions of reference.
Delusions of reference. Okay. And is the term psychotic a term?
Yes, he's floridly psychotic.
So what does that mean, to be floridly psychotic?
He's grossly psychotic. He's just not mildly psychotic. He's out of it.
So showing you poster board with something from the DSM-5, is that correct?
Yeah.
And psychotic features, is that the definition of psychotic features?
Yeah, so a psychosis is one of 4 things. You can hear voices. He never claimed to hear voices. Doesn't hear voices. Doesn't hallucinate. Didn't malinger that he was hallucinating. You can have what's called a formal thought disorder, where the form of your thinking, the organization of your thinking is disorganized. You can tell that from people's actions or from people's speech. Okay? Or you can have delusions. And he had delusions, and his delusions were paranoid. So he had disorganization, racing, frantic thoughts, disorganized thinking, and terror.
And does this scenario, what we've discussed, him going through the week, and getting into Saturday, is this something that you see both forensically and in treatment situations?
Sure.
Is it rare? Is it typical?
I saw a doctor who was psychotic and cut off his testicles because of things like this.
There are memories that Mr. Burgoyne has about that week, and he has a kind of a not as clear a memory during that period of time from when he leaves the hospital until the time of the crash. Is that significant to you at all?
He was probably sleeping part of the time, and when people are psychotic, their memories get disrupted, even about things that aren't legally related. And then subsequently, he had massive brain insults.
So explain then how he goes from being at the hospital, being seen by doctors, guarded, and then to being grossly psychotic by 11:30 at night.
Well, at the side of the road, he's got a broken hip.
No, I mean before the crash. So
Oh,
how
I'm
does he
sorry.
go from how he was at the hospital to being, driving the wrong way on the interstate, grossly psychotic?
So he's frantic. He goes to the hospital. He's desperate. He thinks his life's in danger. He thinks his daughter's life might be in danger. He doesn't know what to do. He probably knew something was wrong in some way. He feels like he's been rebuffed. You can't get any help here. Goes home, goes to sleep, and then there's a bit of a period where we don't know exactly what his experiences are until we know that at 11:15, so abruptly he goes screaming around the corner, so much so that the neighbor thought his car might even tip over. We do know that at the time of the first accident, he's wearing a seatbelt. We know that from the testimony from the troopers. So this is a man who's disorganized, terrorized, frantic, confused, and following cues from the environment, thinking this is what I'm supposed to do and how I'm going to stay safe. I have to do what they tell me to do.
And in your opinion, do you believe that Mr. Burgoyne was suicidal on that night?
No.
Why do you think that?
Well, for one thing, he was wearing a seatbelt. For another thing, he had never, in the depths of depression, he had never tried to harm himself. For another thing, he told me and that he would, for his responsibility to his daughter, he would never do such a thing like that. He's manic. He's doing things to try to preserve his life. All his actions are to promote his safety. He's trying to stay safe. He goes to the hospital. He's trying to follow their orders. He was downstairs protecting himself in case they came to burn down his house. He had, and in the months prior, this is a man who's a hypochondriac. He was afraid of dying. He went to the doctor a lot with all kinds of complaints. He's afraid of dying. He was alarmed when he heard that he had a benign tumor in his pituitary. There's no indication that he's suicidal. And then, aside from that, Ms. Lawrence took pains to say, even though she had adverse legal interactions with him, that he's too ethical. He would never try to harm himself. That would put someone else at risk. He would do it against an inanimate object. And she said that under oath.
And do you think that Mr. Burgoyne was just in some type of kind of blind rage that evening?
No, he was terrified. He's following what he thinks are commands. He's terrified. He's terrified for his own well-being.
Did you see anything in the record of that week, during the course of that week, to support a theory that he was somehow in a rage on Saturday night?
Not that I can think of.
Did there appear to be anything from the records from the hospital that Saturday morning show that he was in a rage?
Saturday morning, when he gets brought to the hospital?
When he's at the hospital, yes.
Oh, in the morning, Saturday morning, not into Sunday early morning. No, he's afraid. He's afraid. He's wary of people. He was wary of the security guy. Like, why is this guy approaching me so quickly? He's afraid. He wants to be safe, and the only time that he feels good or better is when he's under those blankets and think, oh, I'm safe here.
So then, what's your understanding of the injuries that Mr. Burgoyne suffered as a result of well, let me ask you this. Is it significant to you to understand the injuries that Mr. Burgoyne suffered during the accidents, the two accidents?
Yes.
Okay, why would it be significant to understand those?
Well, he had a fractured spine. That was probably relatively minor. He had massive facial fractures. So he had fractures of the zygomatic arch, which goes like this. He had fractures of the bones that form the floor of the orbit, and so he had an orbital floor fracture. He had a fracture of this bone as well. So he had, in order to break those bones, a lot of force has to be applied. And if a lot of force is applied, it means the brain is sloshing back and forth with great acceleration and deceleration in the cranium. So, and then we see the results of that. So it takes about a half an hour for him to get to the hospital. Am I forgetting any fractures? No. Takes about a half an hour for him to get to the hospital, and he's going into shock. The doctor on the scene is saying, this guy's going into shock. His systolic pressure, the higher one, is only 80. Got to get him moving. He gets, and in the ambulance, there's a thing called the Glasgow Coma Scale, and below 8 or 9 is severe head injury. His went from 8 or 9 to 3. Means you're just about dead. You're in a deep, deep coma, not responsive to pain. So if someone comes and pinches you, you don't flinch. Okay. He gets to the hospital. His Glasgow Coma Scale is 3, and he's gurgling. That's the word the hospital used, gurgling. They intubate him, and then they find out that they've intubated him incorrectly, and with an X-ray, and so they have to reposition the endotracheal tube. So he's head injured, he's hypoxic, not enough oxygen, and he's close to death. And then within a short time, they call neurosurgery because he's not waking up. He's not waking up with the proper oxygenation, and he's what the word is, obtunded. He's semi-comatose, or is comatose, and they think that they're wondering if from the massive brain injury that there's swelling. So when the brain swells, there's no place for it to go except down what we call is the foramen magnum, which is down here, and that's where that's where the centers of your brain are, your medulla and your pons that control respiration and life. So that's called coning. And they think he's coning, meaning the swelling of his brain is squishing the parts of his lower part of his brain into a smaller space that can't tolerate it, and that's how you die. And that's when they have to make holes in your brain to make room for the swelling. So they put in what's called an intracerebral bolt. So they make a hole in his skull, and they put in a bolt to measure his cerebral pressures for a few hours. Then he has a series of seizures.
Your Honor, I apologize to interrupt. Could we have a quick sidebar?
Yeah.
Let me ask this question and we can go back. There's hospital records of Mr. Burgoyne after the accident, correct?
Yeah.
You reviewed those?
Yeah.
What injuries did Mr. Burgoyne suffer that are important to you and relevant to you in discussing Mr. Burgoyne's psychiatric condition at the time of the accident and after the accident? And if you could confine your answers to what injuries he suffered from the crash that are relevant to that analysis.
Fractured. So we had 3 fractures: the facial bones, the hip, the acetabular, the socket was smashed up and fractured in many pieces, and the back and the lumbar spine. And that was the cause of his pain, and that impacted him in prison, his pain and need for surgery in the hospital. So going back to his head injuries, after they put the bolt in, he had a series of seizures, and they could only stop it by giving him intravenous. It's a drug like Valium. It's called lorazepam, and then they put him on a medication called Keppra, which is a medicine against seizures, but also has some effect on treating bipolar disorder. We call it an adjunctive medicine. Has some effect in treating, and there's several other kinds of medications that are anticonvulsants, anti-seizure medicines that also work for bipolar. Then he goes to surgery, and they fix his hip at 3 or 4 in the morning on Sunday morning, I think
Your
it
Honor,
was.
I'm going to object again. We were unresponsive to the question.
So I'm going to sustain the objection, and just listen to Mr. Kadam's question, and let's get an answer to his question.
So let me ask, you talked about the seizures and the medications. How are those relevant to your psychiatric evaluation of Mr. Burgoyne?
Well, he had 2 or possibly 3 sets of seizures. So even though he was on the Keppra, the next day he had another set of seizures, and then the next day, the next night, he probably had a 3rd set of seizures. That's one of the explanations for why he was noted to be kicking, biting, and swatting at nursing staff. The reason would be he was either delirious, or he's what we call post-ictal, meaning having had seizures, and after seizures there's a period of confusion. So he had he had 2 sets of seizures and possibly a 3rd one that was that I'm inferring may have been the cause of him being swatting at nurses and things like that, which were incongruous for him. So those are relevant along with the other things that happened to him with regard to his brain. So he had the massive head injury. He had a bunch of anesthetics. He was put on anticonvulsants. He had a period of hypoxia. And all those things impacted his brain, which impacted his memory. And more specifically, seizures are the most effective treatment for mania. And when he finally got stabilized in the few days afterwards, his mania was over, even though he still remained paranoid and psychotic. But the mania had ended. So was it the head injury that disrupted circuits that contributed to mania? Was it the anesthetics? Was it the Keppra, which has anti-bipolar effects, anti-manic effects? Was it the series of seizures? It's important to understand when I say seizures. So the most effective treatment for seizures, most effective treatment for mania is to take someone to having electroconvulsive therapy. And that's just the method by which we induce seizures since the 1950s. Before the 1950s, they'd give people insulin and make them have a seizure by dropping their blood sugar.
Objection again, Your Honor. Unresponsive.
Yeah, so I think I need a couple of more questions to keep him keep the doctor on the point of the questions.
Well, I think you've answered the question on the seizures now and why it was important to you. How about the medication that he was given?
Keppra is an anticonvulsant. There are several anticonvulsants that work for bipolar disorder, for mania, not for depression particularly. One works for depression, but not that one. And Keppra is a sort of second-tier medication for mania. It's not the first-level medication, but it has been used. There's some literature to support it. And then we don't know the effects of the anesthesia and all the other things that happened, because they all happened, and it's hard to tease out which or in combination of all these things that impacted his brain caused him to cease his mania.
So I want to go back and ask you this question. How can someone that you described as so psychotic and delusional and manic on Saturday evening drive his car?
Oh, that's not a complicated question. People who are psychotic and juggle, ride a bicycle, get themselves to doctor's offices. We have psychotic patients come to the hospital all the time who are paranoid, and they come. They're not dangerous, but they come to the hospital. They drive. They get around.
Is there a term for that?
It's what it's called. It's procedural. So driving a car is procedural. You look around, you see where things are, and you can start the car. It's a very overlearned activity, and so he's driven a car thousands and thousands of times. It's a procedural memory that it's hard to lose. In fact, people who are even demented can retain procedural qualities. You can be demented and still be able to ride a bicycle.
So back to did Mr. Burgoyne have memory after the second crash that he related to you?
I don't understand the question.
The second crash.
Yeah.
With the cruiser and his truck. Does Mr. Burgoyne relate to you what was going on for him during that period of time? Does
Yes.
he have a memory? Okay.
Yeah.
What did Mr. Burgoyne tell you was going on during that period of time?
He had to, after the second, he remembered that he was in a lot of pain. He tries to go, he's trying to go to the next set of lights, which I think is where the white lights of the ambulance or wherever he's going. He's trying to go to the next stage to make, he has to go on with the test that he's being put in, and he's trying to go that direction. And then he remembers that suddenly there was a lot of pain. He's tackled or whatever, and he's in a lot of pain. He realizes something, I can't really walk that well, and suddenly I'm in a lot of pain. That was the very next thing that happened.
Does he relate to you past that at the scene, or what are his memories after he's tackled that are significant for you in your diagnosis?
I don't recall if he remembers what Di Fiore was saying to him.
What are you referring to?
Officer Trooper Di Fiore was calling him a dickhead and a piece of shit on the videotape.
Is that relevant to you?
Yes.
Will that come later with regard to...
Well, it was right after.
Did Mr. Burgoyne ever relate that he even heard that at the scene?
I don't think he recalls that.
But your review of the video is that happened.
Yes.
Did you review all the other cruiser videos from that evening?
Yes.
Did you do you recall seeing Officer Shepard's cruiser video?
Yes.
And do you recall seeing Mr. Burgoyne leaving the median area and heading to Shepard's vehicle?
Yes.
Does viewing that video impact your opinion at all in this case?
Not at all. it supports it. He's going towards the car that he thought was provided for him as the next stage.
Were you able to see on that video whether he came out of the meeting and went right to Officer Shepard's car?
No, he does a little jog around, not running jog, a little turn around.
So there's nothing on that video that would change your opinion in this case?
No, he was in extreme pain, extremely head injured.
Did Mr. Burgoyne have any memory of going in the ambulance as he left the scene?
Yeah, he does.
What does he relate to you about that?
When he got into the ambulance, there was a woman who also gave the deposition, like one of the ambulance attendants, who he hears her voice and he thinks, oh, this must be the feminine messenger that I've been hearing or inferring from my computer and other kinds of ideas of reference. He always thought it had a feminine quality, and he thought he knew her, which he did. She testified she'd never seen him before, but he thought she was, the final stage, or here I am to take you, and that he felt a sense of relief that finally he had met up with this female presence in the ambulance.
And does Mr. Burgoyne relate to you kind of coming to at the hospital, or where does it pick up for Mr. Burgoyne after going to the hospital?
He has some vague memory of being in the hospital and hearing a voice saying, let her in, or let her in the room, or words to that effect, which he thinks means it was referencing part of defense team. He doesn't know. It's an inference. And then he remembers being afraid and disorganized in the hospital. He wasn't clear what had happened. The guards, one guard was taking pictures of him with a cell phone. The guards were saying, calling him names like piece of shit. Some guards were just sort of hostile to him. He couldn't understand why. He's handcuffed to the bed. The TV would change. He thought that if on the menu, he had delusions of reference with regard to the menu. The guy brings in the menu for him to select his food, and he thinks if he selects the proper food, it's a message to whoever his rescuers will be, the government, to get him out of there. If he chose the proper food, he didn't really understand what was going on, but he couldn't tell why the guards seemed so hostile to him, why they were taking pictures of him, and what his situation was.
And so, I think you testified already. Is he still manic?
No.
Is he still? What's his psychiatric condition, in your opinion, at the time of the hospital?
Well, it changes. There are times when he's delirious. So that third event before Dr. Martin saw him, I think might have been the 12th. He's swatting at the nurses. I don't know if he was delirious or, again, post convulsions that hadn't been witnessed, because that's not necessarily witnessed, because that's certainly out of character for him to do that. And then as he starts to more stabilize, he's just more purely confused and paranoid. He doesn't understand how he can be in this situation. He has partial memories. His brain is still healing up after nearly failing and nearly dying. And he's not understanding his situation.
And did you review?
So, this is a good time to stop. So you can step down. Thank you. Understanding that it does take a little bit of time for everyone to get out of the courthouse, and if we don't have the courthouse emptied by 4:30, I get in trouble. So I'm going to excuse you for the night. We'll resume with the doctor's testimony first thing tomorrow morning. So again, the caution is avoid all media all radio, newspaper, internet research, any temptation to even want to research psychiatric conditions or anything else like that. Please don't. And just have a great night. We'll see you tomorrow morning. Thank you.
All rise.
Can I see counsel for a minute?